I'm here with Eric Wargo. This has been a long time coming because I think I refer to your books like in every episode that I do. And so this is an honor. I really appreciate it. Found myself in your neck of the woods in DC and, had to do this, and I'm really excited. You've written 3 books. The 2 that I've read are Time Loops and From Nowhere. And they're just incredible in the world of kind of AI doomsdayers, where that's, all the rage these days, where I think people struggle to kind of separate the human mind from kind of the robotic mind that is AI. You have a new theory of mind that I think comports with a lot of people's intuitions as to how the human mind works. I want to start with a really interesting concept that you actually present at the beginning of Time Loops, which is this idea that often prophecies are, you get some sort of message. That message actually causes you to react in a certain way to the message that then manifests or causes the actual prophecy to come to fruition. And the traditional example of this might be Oedipus. How do you explain that? What sort of model do you apply to that?
If it works the way I think it works, and I think that various trends in science are converging, I think, on an actual physical explanation for how it works. If it works that way, prophecies have to be self-fulfilling. Now, what does that mean? Events in the future are, in a sense, fixed, in the same way events in the past are fixed. Now, if that's the case, any kind of time travel, and precognition is really a form of time travel, it's a form of informational time travel, cannot change history. Okay, this is a misconception. People somehow they think about precognition or they think about time travel. They think, but wait, you could go into the past and change history and kill your grandfather, and so you wouldn't, you couldn't be born and all that. You had grandfather paradox type stuff. That's it's kind of faulty reasoning, and in fact, physicists in the 80s kind of did the math. I mean, they got interested in wormholes and things like that, and they did the math and found that no, in fact, if you send a particle through a wormhole or a billiard ball through a wormhole and try to deflect it away from the wormhole, it fails. You're always going to deflect yourself into the wormhole, and you're always going to be in what's called a closed time-light curve or a time loop. It means that the universe is self-consistent. It means paradox doesn't occur. And that's the definition of paradox, something that can't occur. So any intervention in time, any backward influence via information alone or via physical objects traveling through a wormhole or a time machine or something like that, that adventure in the past, whatever it is already part of the backstory of getting in the time machine in the future. And there's really no problem. There's really no problem with time travel or with information traveling in time. It doesn't lead to paradox. You just have to wrap your head around the idea that you now are the product of time traveling information already, and maybe time travelers. Your history, your past history includes, all that time traveling, either physical time traveling of advanced beings or, and at the very least, information in your head that's traveled back in time from your future. You now are the product of information refluxing from your future and influencing your past and influencing your present. That's why we can say that prophecy is always self-fulfilling. Now, that doesn't mean it in a simplistic way that you have a dream and things are going to turn out exactly the way you dreamed it. There are all kinds of reasons why we don't interpret prophecies accurately. There's all kinds of reasons why the brain distorts information coming from our future. I think one of the basic things that we're precognizing is our survival. And so we're in a sort of time loop relationship to our future surviving self. And imagine that that's the case for even, bacteria in the primordial soup, that it goes back to the beginnings of the evolution of life. It's just a new way of thinking about causation.
Yeah, it's interesting because on the one hand, I think belief in the block universe is traditionally associated with nihilism or something. It's like if future is sort of cemented in stone. And then on the other hand, what you're saying is there is sort of evolution upwards towards probably greater consciousness. And especially if artists are reaching forward into their future for kind of inspiration, you know, presumably that future is very rich and, you know, involves maybe more consciousness than is present. I do want to get into just a few examples because I think that's really powerful for kind of the average person getting into this sort of stuff because it's so trippy and not, you know, in accordance with their normal worldview. And so the example that I love is Carl Jung has this patient. She's this kind of very inaccessible kind of hyper-rationalist patient who he can't kind of get through to. Obviously, Carl Jung is this contemporary of Freud's, but who's even trippier in many ways than Freud. And he sees her and she comes in and she says, look, I had this dream last night that I was gifted this golden scarab beetle and it was this really meaningful thing to me. She doesn't quite know what to make of it. And as she's recounting the story, she sees a scarab beetle coming down off the windowsill and he then takes the scarab beetle and gifts it to her. And it's this like mind-blowing, super meaningful thing for her that like changes her paradigm. And so it's the attentional patterns of actually knowing the sort of prophecy or the dream, the precognitive dream, changing her reaction, her being aware of that dream actually caused the whole thing to happen, which I just find so fascinating.
That's my favorite example of a time loop. That's the one I always use when people ask me what a time loop is. That's the example because it's so perfect. It shows exactly how a dream changes behavior, and the behavior leads to the outcome in an unforeseen way. I mean, she couldn't have known. I mentioned how dreams, they show us the future, but not in a very clear way, and often in a not directly, intentionally actionable way. But they change our behavior, like being deflected by like billiards being deflected. It's like that was a billiard ball from her future, which deflected her to this experience in her therapist's office the next day. And lo and behold, that experience that it deflected her toward was what she dreamed about, but she couldn't have known that when she had the dream. So yeah, that's a beautiful example.
Do you have any other examples that you love?
Oh, so many. I mean,
I mean, another one would be just Oedipus, which is obviously sort of mythological, but do you want to tell that story?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot to say about Oedipus because, I mean, if anyone knows anything about Oedipus these days, they're going to be thinking about, Sigmund Freud, because of the Oedipus complex and all that. And he focused, this Oedipus story is that there's this prophecy that this young prince of Thebes is going to grow up and murder his father and marry his mother. And so to evade this prophecy, when he learns about this prophecy, he flees his city. He doesn't know that he's actually been brought up in a foster or an adopted family. So he flees his city, winds up killing this man at a crossroads who turns out to be his father, and then winds up marrying his mother unknowingly and becoming, so he fulfills the process. It fulfills the prophecy exactly in his efforts to evade the prophecy. And this is, this logic is, I think, crucial to how we relate to time and to our precognition, which we deny our precognition. We deny that prophecy, partly because of cultural taboos and all kinds of things. The interesting thing is that Freud, I mean, he was only interested in that incestuous idea, like that part of the story. So he talked about the Oedipus complex and, how children are sexually attracted to their opposite sex parent and want to kill because they're jealous of their same sex parent and so on. But he sort of denied, he didn't believe in precognition, and he denied the rest of the story about the prophecy and all that because, that's just pre-modern, superstition. The thing is, in Freud's own life, the dream that sort of started it all for Freud was a dream he had in 1895 famous dream. And he spent like 14 pages of his landmark book, The Interpretation of Dreams, interpreting this dream through free association and stuff like that. Well, like 28 years later, I think, I may be getting the number wrong. He developed an oral cancer, which like all these elements, these key elements in that dream he'd had almost 3 decades earlier came true in his life. And he never acknowledged that dream was a premonition. But it's like in Freud's own life, he lived out that Oedipus story. I mean, he denied precognition. He denied prophecy. He denied, the very existence and like patients would bring him precognitive dreams all the time because people have these dreams all the time. And they would bring him their dreams and he would just explain them away in some facile way. And in his own life, he winds up denying prophecy and then developing this oral cancer, which, by the way, was caused by his smoking. And there are hints in the dream of that fact, So it has been argued that, well, had he, paid attention to this dream as a warning from his future, he might have quit smoking and all that. That gets into these problems we talked about earlier of time loops and foreclosing a foreseen future. It doesn't work as simply as that. But that's another way in which we fulfill a prophecy by denying it or ignoring it or shutting it aside. So I think that's a hugely important archetype for modern people because we live in a culture that denies that the future can influence us, especially in dreams. And what effect does that? What impact does that have on our mental health, on our fortunes?
That's absolutely fascinating because you think of Freud as believing that most people are sort of repressed and they have sort of an ego and an id, and the id is sort of this compartmentalized savage self or something, all these repressed desires. And so maybe the id for him was in some ways realizing that like his own work was actually sort of somewhat autobiographical because I think, he did have that interesting relationship with his own mother. Yeah. And so, it's like, who watches The Watchmen or whatever? He's this like preeminent psychologist, but in fact, maybe a lot of his own work and theories are actually projection of his own subconscious.
Well, it's his, this is why I think Freud is so interesting and important in all this, because even though he didn't believe in precognition per se, his theory, what's sometimes called his metapsychology, which is that's that kind of layered model of consciousness where you have the tip of the iceberg, that's the conscious self, and then this buried, submerged, unconscious. That theory of the unconscious is super important, and it's a ready-made theory of precognition because really precognition manifests in all the ways that interested Freud in his career. So you begin with dreams. That's the number one way that people become aware that they are precognitive, is through having precognitive dreams. But also they manifest in waking life in these kinds of what he called the psychopathology of everyday life, which is, that was the title of his second book, which is things like slips of the tongue and what we now call synchronicities. He didn't have that word yet. That was a term introduced by Carl Jung. More generally just, having a random thought about an old friend and then seeing him on the street, like that. It's a very typical experience. And other like foibles, like neurotic symptoms or whatever all these kind of quirks of human behavior. That's how precognition, that's how it gets our attention. That's how we experience it. And creativity. Which is the subject of my most recent book and my next book that's coming. So it's a ready-made theory to understand precognition. We just have to, the way I always put it, you picture the iceberg with the tip on top and the submerged base. But usually we think of time as an axis, an x-axis, running from left to right. So tip the iceberg on its side. And just think of that future, that big submerged part. That's the future. It's we don't know the future yet. We can't interpret. We can't correctly interpret all this information coming at us and manifesting in all these oblique indirect symbolic ways. But that's where it's coming from. It's not coming from some submerged layer of thought that we're not aware of, because that's kind of a paradoxical idea anyway. It makes much more sense to think of that, the unconscious, as our future consciousness that's impacting us now.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like you get shards of it. I often think when I have these sort of conversations with the AI dogmatic people, I think AI is going to take over everything. I always say, well, I think the human mind works in a fundamentally distinct way. And I often cite your book, which is a really interesting model of the mind as kind of a hybrid quantum classical computer. And the very creative and interesting idea that you bring up, and Robert Lanza and biocentrism also sort of touches on, that there's temporal non-locality in quantum systems. So, you can do a double slit experiment in the future. It seems like one interpretation that's affecting, the one done with an entangled photon in the past. And you can even reverse qubit positions in quantum computations. And so a lot of people, even who are working on quantum computers, obviously the bottleneck is the hardware and getting the chips to work, have hypothesized that you can send information back in time on the semantic application layer in a hypothetical working quantum computer. Yep. And so if our brain is a quantum system, which people as prominent as Roger Penrose have hypothesized, maybe we can glitch into the future and access some of this information, send it back in time.
I think this is going to be, I think what you're describing, the kind of use of quantum computers as or tesseracts is the kind of the term I use from science fiction, as like these 4-dimensional information processors and communication devices. I mean, I think that is really, it's kind of the link. It's the link that's going to lead to true time travel. Okay. I think, because it's that informational time travel, that's already happening. You can look at biological systems as models for how it works. And yeah, in a quantum computer, you can theoretically scale up that causal indeterminacy that's happening on the quantum level. You can scale that up into a usable, object that you can measure at 2 time points and get a sort of output prior to an input, in a sense.
Yes.
And you scale that up in a quantum computer server that you leave plugged in for many years. It really opens the doorway to actually communicating across time. This is the really cool premise of William Gibson's The Peripheral. I don't know if you've read the book or seen the series. The series is actually really quite good. Yeah. It's the premise is that this video gamer in the American South, around now, is in this advanced sim and flying this drone in this futuristic city, and she thinks it's a sim, whatever, and she sees this character getting murdered, she thinks it's an NPC getting murdered. But then she gets a call via a quantum computer server from this publicist who lives in London in the 22nd century. And he tells her that in fact, what she witnessed, she was actually piloting a real drone in future London via a quantum computer server, and had witnessed a real murder. And so he enlists her aid in solving this murder across, a century, it's a really cool premise, but I think William Gibson is really prescient, obviously. I mean, he foretold cyberspace essentially. And I think this is the next thing. Yeah. And I think people who are thinking about quantum computing simply from the standpoint of just speeding up number crunching or whatever are really missing the boat.
I think it's absolutely the next thing. And the idea that the body is warm, wet, and noisy and not, actually a good conducive to quantum coherence is slowly being destroyed. It's going out the window. You have quantum biology. You have, enzyme creation using quantum tunneling. You have birds navigating home using the CRY4 protein spin, which is, basically a kind of a magnetometer. It's detecting the magnetic field of the earth and allowing them to do that. And, you have other examples as well, and these things are getting proven out over and over and over and over again. And I think actually, are you familiar with Rupert Sheldrake by any chance?
Oh, sure.
So like, I think he doesn't have, really clear mathematical models around how any of this stuff works, but he has really good experiments showing that humans in their bodies often just instinctively know when certain things are about to happen. And it's almost like we become, it's like we know that, or animals know that earthquakes are about to happen. Kids know when their parents are near.
Right.
And it's almost like you get overeducated, you get your, elite Western liberal education or whatever, and you like unlearn that. But that's, of course, like incredibly instinctive. It makes total sense. And even prosaically, if you think about how the mind learns, it is in low sample size. You come out of the womb with like, a fear of snakes and with a Chomskyan pre-grammar for certain things. And that's not how a classical computer works. You need to, look at like the large language models that OpenAI is using. You're running the internet through that thing. Like those are two very different things. So I think we have to be open to this quantum, precognizance of the future model.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, Stuart Hameroff, I'm sure you know his work on microtubules. I think that's going to be I think microtubules are probably going to be the mechanism here. I think there are many quantum, like I say in time loops, I think the brain, a lot of people simplistically say, oh, the brain is a quantum computer. It's not that simple. It's a hybrid. It's a hybrid of classical and quantum systems, meshed. We understand at this point, through decades of neuroimaging and neuroscience that we have at this point, we understand really well that the classical circuit level, way in which the brain takes input from the senses and controls the body and all that, in a way that you can liken to a computer chip in a robot. It's just way more complicated than that. But that is true. That classical level of computation and control over a system is true. But what's happening inside neurons is what we're only beginning to understand. And lo and behold, these things that used to be just thought of as the bones of neurons turn out to be these really interesting, highly dynamic structures that, they're quantum, it's already been shown that they are superconductors, which really suggests that, these quantum relationships are going on.
Yeah, what was that study that came out a few months ago that they're super radiant? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. There's been a bunch of stuff coming out from this team that Hameroff works with, and I'm forgetting their names, but there's a lot of cool stuff coming out. But the thing is, I think that, I almost think that Hameroff could almost win the Nobel Prize for this work if he wasn't focused on consciousness. I think consciousness is really kind of a red herring in all this. I mean, he's wanting to show how this generates consciousness, but I think,
and just for people that don't know, the way he got onto this is Penrose created this theoretical model for, the brain being a quantum system, which is kind of answering this age-old question of why we see discrete macroscopic reality in kind of general relativity form when actually it's sort of probabilistic, and it's, underlying at least subatomic nature. Like, where does that cutoff occur? And so he writes the Emperor's Mind or something.
New Mind,
and then the Emperor's New Mind, I think, is the one with Hameroff. Hameroff is this anesthesiologist who realizes that when you shut down the microtubules, the rest of the body is running as if it's totally alive, but consciousness shuts down. And so he thinks it's the center of consciousness. So.
Well, that in and of itself is an interesting point, but I think focusing on the question of consciousness, it's such a fraught area. Someone on Twitter last month posted a graph of like 200 different theories of consciousness, and they all, I'm sympathetic to a lot of these, both the hard materialist versus the, even the eliminative materialist explanations and the panpsychic. They're all interesting. And I think you can learn from all of them, but I don't think any physical explanation is going to satisfyingly explain consciousness.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a hopeless task to try and say, here's the answer to consciousness with this one physical process. It's a very interesting physical process, but I don't think he's going to convince people, with that. But these microtubules he's studying are, I think, the basis for precognition, because if they're quantum computers, if they can then theoretically do what we were talking about, which is scale up this ability to sort of have a system where you're measuring at one point and then measuring at a second point and then getting information refluxing from that second measurement and reading it out in the past. You string a lot of those together in some system, well, then you have a precognitive circuit. And what's fascinating about microtubules is that these control the shape of the cell. They control like the dendrites and axons, forming new connections, and they control the size of a synaptic connection. Like, when you have a memory forming, they will expand that synaptic connection to facilitate that memory. So they're in charge of memory formation. And if precognition is a form of memory, as I argue, and as a lot of people have argued, then right there you have a potential mechanism. You have a potential physical mechanism to explain this thing that has been rejected for centuries because, it's impossible. It's, has no physical basis. Well, I think we are now converging on a possible physical mechanism. I mean, that's a testable hypothesis at the very least.
Have you heard of a Russian scientist with the last name Lieberman, Liber? Okay. Two friends of mine, Daniil and David Lieberman, they previously worked at Snapchat. They're absolute geniuses. They sort of resemble like Bond villains or something. They like have this mind meld going on. They use one phone. They're very eccentric. Their father knew Hamarov or I think knew Penrose rather, and was really interested in cytoskeletal learning. But okay, I have a different possible candidate outside of microtubules for a quantum system inside the brain. And this is not, I would say, mutually exclusive with microtubules, but are you familiar with the caudate nucleus and the putamen? So Gary Nolan studies this stuff, and that's this part of the basal ganglia and the dorsal striatum of the brain. And if you hook somebody up to an fMRI while they're playing the game Go, this more complex East Asian version of chess, when they make a brilliant move, and what defines a brilliant move is a move that doesn't make any sense in the context of like the incremental go forward rational decision. It only makes sense in the context of an endpoint in which the person wins. So it's often based on the other person slipping up or whatever, their adversary slipping up. That part of the brain lights up in an fMRI. And then that part of the brain, according to Gary Nolan, is also much more neuronally dense when you see a greater preponderance of UFOs, and you have more premonition, you're a little more psychic. And so I wonder if that is not part of the quantum processing at the very least.
Well, the quantum processing would be going on within the cells in that brain area, but that makes perfect sense. That system is part of the reward system. And so it's involved in our registration of rewards, our learning based on rewards, our predictions based on past rewards. And that system, I think, is central. It's central. It's kind of the central classically in that classical computer model in terms of the organism, changing its behavior based on rewards and getting excited about possible future rewards and anticipated rewards and all that. So that's what that system is doing. But all the neurons in all parts of the brain have those microtubules and have those quantum components in them. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's gonna somehow prove to be important in future decades when we understand this stuff better.
And in time loops and in From Nowhere, you have so many just fascinating examples in kind of the zeitgeist and culture of precognition. And so I don't know if you want to, just cite some of those, like Michael Richards, this resident artist,
right,
and the Twin Towers. Do you remember that one?
Oh yeah. Yes. His story is, it's tragic, but, fascinating. Michael Richards, and this is Michael Rolando Richards, not Michael Richards, the comedian. But Michael Rolando Richards was a sculptor, a black sculptor in the 90s. I mean, he was sort of an up and coming sculptor in the New York art world in the 90s. And he did a series of, like, all of his works were like obsessed with flight. And he would do these sculptural self-portraits of himself as a Tuskegee Airman. And the Tuskegee Airmen were black aviators in World War II who sort of distinguished themselves, you know, in their piloting, but then were subject to all the racism that you might expect. And anyway, he would portray himself as a Tuskegee Airman. In some sculptures, he had crashed to the ground, or he had tried to parachute, or was trying to parachute into a target that was too small, or and in the sculpture that made him most famous, which he did in 1999, while he was in Miami, he portrayed himself as a Tuskegee Airman standing vertically erect and levitating off the ground, and being impaled by airplanes. By a bunch of airplanes. And the sculpture is called Tar Baby versus Saint Sebastian. And Saint Sebastian was the medieval saint who, you know, is always depicted like pierced by arrows. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so he depicted himself pierced by planes, as a martyr pierced by planes. Okay, so he, you know, on the basis of the strength of his work, including, I assume, that sculpture, and this would be another time loop, he got he was awarded studio space for 6 months in the Twin Towers. The Lower Manhattan Cultural Council had been issuing studios to like cohorts of 15 artists, like for 6 months, you know, so 2 cohorts a year. And so he was part of the summer 2001 cohort of artists. And he, alone among those artists, had stayed in his studio the night of September 10th and was killed on the morning of September 11th. So when you know that story, and then you see this sculpture that he did, where he's martyred, impaled by planes. But the thing is, people who visited his studio said that he was working on other sculptures that were similarly like unbelievable. Like one of them was of him riding a burning meteor. And another one was of his torso, with wings, like it was called Fallen Angel. So, and his other works, you know, he did some pen and pencil stuff too, including one that had a plane crash, like a lot of sculptures of planes crashing.
That's so crazy.
So, you know, what do you make of that? And, it's, you know, but the thing is, this is so common, in artists. And when you delve into the lives of artists, I mean, there are a lot of famous cases. So there's a famous case that I talk about in Time Loops, and you'll read about it in most any book on ESP, was Morgan Robertson, who was this science fiction author, around the turn of the 20th century, who wrote this famous novel. Well, it was not famous at the time, but he wrote this novel called Futility, about the collision of the biggest ever ocean liner called the Titan with an iceberg on an April night in the North Atlantic on its third voyage between Liverpool and New York. Okay. So, 14 years later.
And you have blue-blooded elite families
yes,
on board.
and they all die because there's not enough lifeboats.
It's the Titanic.
It's the Titanic, essentially. Stories like that. But the thing is, when you delve into and it's easy for skeptics to go, oh, well, in a world of, chance, that's going to happen, sometimes. And then we single out those examples and we make something of them, but it's all just random. Well, no, I mean, when you study the lives of artists, you find this stuff happens all the time, not necessarily with big events in the news. I mean, mostly, as with precognitive dreams, it happens mostly with personal upheavals in our own lives, things that wouldn't necessarily even be significant to anybody else, but they are meaningful to us. And when we're dreaming or when we're creating art or whatever, those things come out. And it's just incredibly, incredibly common. I mean, I have so many. I mean, I filled this book with examples, and I've got a million more. I'm writing a second book on the same, a similar subject with even more cases from writers. So it's a very, very common phenomenon.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The idea that prophets aren't real that's a modern idea. That's a symptom of modernity. It's not, that's kind of an aberration if you look at actually like the long time scale of human civilization. And you even, I don't know, this is a weird example, but like Alex Jones, say what you will about the guy as far as some of his other beliefs, but are you familiar with, he had an on-air call on CNN where he goes, Osama bin Laden, if you take down the Twin Towers, I'm going to come after you or something. Like, it's just this absurd, like, literally what happened in 6 months before. And he's like he's on cable. You can't fake that. He's on, CNN.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah.
There's a million. There's so many prophecies, whatever you want to call them, of 9/11. I mean, there's simply by virtue of the fact that, there was the internet already at that point, and, people can now collect all that stuff and put it online. So it's like, it's an overwhelming mass of material, prophecying that event. But
yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, there's so many. My dad actually he's kind of a self-help author, and he wrote a book called The Tools, and in it he talks about how he would always dream of an earthquake on January 17th. And that was both the day, that's my birthday, that's the day I was born. And then 2 years later, that was the Northridge quake.
Oh, wow.
And we live in LA. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know. Very, very interesting. And I bet you the more people you poll, like it's a much higher percentage of people that can sort of pull these examples out than would meet the eye. One interesting instantiation of this that we've talked about in our phone calls is you have this remote viewing program that the CIA ran. I think it was CIA and then DIA from 1972 to 1995. And it was a psychic spy program. And whenever I tell people this, they're like, no way, like that can't be real. But you have guys like Joseph McMoneagle who have won the Legion of Merit for over 200 instances in which he's helped, add intelligence in very vital cases, finding hostages, drawing up, Russian nuclear sites, like pretty intense, interesting stuff. And you even have Jessica Utz, who's a statistician out of Stanford, I believe, and Ray Hyman, who's a skeptic, I think out of University of Oregon, coming in saying, we expect this maybe to be debunked, and, coming in with a, pretty scientific method, going through the, recently declassified documents for Stargate, that's the name of the program, and coming out saying, we think there's some inexplicable thing here. And we actually think that there is sort of a psychic function when it comes to human beings. So
Utz did an analysis of a lot of evidence for psychic functioning, not just the Stargate program, I don't believe. And she found overwhelming evidence. And she's been very, very vocal about this. I mean, she was the president of the American Statistical Society and stuff one year. And she's, in her address that year, her presidential address, she said, this is evidence that nobody would question. It's so strong. The statistical, the quality of the evidence is so strong that if it were in any other field, nobody would question this.
Yes.
But people reject it, and they don't even want to see the evidence. They reject. They don't even want to confront the evidence.
It's fascinating. And every elite university, from the Rhine Center at Duke, I think that was 1931 to 1960. And then you have SRI, in the late 60s, early 70s. You have the Princeton Anomalous Research Lab. You have WashU St. Louis with McDonnell Douglas. They had a parapsychology program. You have a lot of these elite universities pretty open-minded when it comes to kind of mind over matter effects and remote viewing. And you talk to anybody from those programs and they all come out saying, yeah, we're pretty sure they're like weak effects. They're hard to instrumentalize. That's hard to turn in. We can't turn them into math. We're in the Stone Age in this stuff, but it's real. It's like definitely real.
I've got some kind of contrarian opinions about why they say that the effects are small, or why they think they get small.
I want to hear your contrarian opinion.
Well, I think they're very often using the wrong conceptual frameworks for understanding this stuff. I mean, I think as you probably know from hints in my work, I suspect, my hypothesis is that a lot of what gets called remote viewing is really precognition.
Yep.
And I think more and more, I think a lot of people in the remote viewing community push back on that strongly, but I think, some of the key players in that community are open to that idea more and more. I mean, I think Russell Targ even has sort of come around to that idea that feedback may be important beyond just training remote viewers. That maybe that's what remote viewers are really seeing. They're seeing that feedback in the future.
That's a really interesting point.
And the thing is, if you went at it, if you studied this stuff with that in mind, what kind of different results would you get? I think people, from the start of psychical research, this was presumed to be telepathy. That was the model that was introduced by Frederick Myers in 1882. And the Society for Psychical Research, collected all these amazing stories, amazing mountain of data, basically. And it was all interpreted in this mode of telepathy. At that point, precognition was not even thinkable. And there was this new technology, the telegraph, which provided this nice metaphor for understanding these effects, and so, psychical research and then early ESP research kind of carried that forward, and telepathy was the dominant model until the television age. Okay. So the television age in the second half of the 20th century, it got reconceptualized, and this kind of older, vague idea of clairvoyance got turned into the dominant kind of framing for psychic phenomena, remote viewing. That's television, it's taking another technology from the culture and applying it and using it to help understand some kind of psychic effect. But the thing is, if that's not really what's going on, then your results are only going to get you you're only going to get, you're not going to get the best results. If that paradigm is dominating your thinking, you're going to miss a lot of evidence that didn't fit within that paradigm. And you're not going to be studying it in the most effective way. So, that's my contrarian opinion. A lot of people will throw tomatoes at the TV set or at the computer when they see me say that. I mean, people in remote, who do remote viewing, very much favor the idea that, their consciousness is non-local and that they are traveling across space or seeing, things across space. But I think there's compelling reason to think that this is a temporal relationship.
Well, I spoke to Hal Puthoff, who ran the Stargate, the psychic spy program for the CIA for a very long time, about your hypothesis that actually it's precognition. You're accessing a future knowledge state, and that your feedback that the target was right. So say you drop a Russian nuclear base, getting confirmation that that was actually correct might be essential to actually the accuracy of the remote viewing in the first place, because you're not just remote perceiving anything. And he seemed open to it. So I don't know, the fact that he's open to it, I mean, he's as deep as anybody on this stuff scientifically. So that's a good sign for you. But I guess in the case of like a random event generator or affecting a random quantum mechanical process with your mind, how would that fit in with sort of, it wouldn't be like you'd have a pre-knowledge of the result or something?
Well, there's two answers to that.
Yeah.
One is, PK doesn't need to be related to precognition. I mean, there's a lot that we don't know about the mind and its abilities and effects of biological systems on things in the vicinity. There are a lot of possibilities there, but I'm not a believer in this construct of psi. That was really originally a word that was just to denote a black box. I mean, this is what we don't know about. Let's call it psi. But like,
it was originally is the Greek letter for the wave function for.
Well, there's that
equation.
Yeah. But in parapsychology, it just sort of became this black box term. But it, like all black box terms, it got reified, and people took it. Oh, there's this thing called psi, and it's this force or whatever, and people treat it as a thing rather than just as an open question. And calling these different things psi is itself biasing people towards thinking that they're going to find one force or something that explains all these things. And I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, I think precognition I'm anticipating that there's going to be a pretty not that amazing physical process mechanism that can explain it, but PK effects may be explained very differently, may have a very different, something very different going on there. But the second answer, though, is that there is the possibility that research on PK effects is influenced by the experimenter's precognition. And this is an argument that's been made by Ed May. I don't know if you've talked to him before, but he sort of took over from Hal Puthoff. He sort of led that program, or the research arm of that program, in the sort of its final decade, in the 90s, until it was, declassified and supposedly ended in 1995.
Don't think it ever ended.
Yeah. But the argument he has made is that, he's not a believer in the PK stuff. He thinks that the micro PK results, that is the supposed effects of consciousness on random number generators, can be explained by, I forget the term he uses, but he has a good term for, decision augmentation. That the researcher's precognition is drawing them to start an experiment or start a trial at a time when the random numbers are going to generate the results that he wants, or he or she wants. I think that is, I haven't looked at the PK data, so I can't speak to that. But I think that decision augmentation theory is potentially hugely important across science, because if this is an effect, then what kind of effect is this happening in any kind of biophysical experiment, or in the health sciences, or in psychology? It could be a hugely important factor, who knows, in the replication crisis that we're seeing. I think it's a really important question that I hope some people will start I hope some people will take that ball and run with it and really investigate that potentiality. But you have to accept precognition first. Sure. That's the barrier that we're up against right now.
Yeah, it's a big barrier. When it comes to kind of remote viewing anything in the future, or these prophecies or predictions, sometimes it feels like you're looking at like a bunch of alternative possible timelines, and you're not looking at the definite thing, and so, like, how would you explain that?
I'm not a believer in alternative timelines.
Okay. You're a block universe.
I'm a block universe guy. And I think that giving ourselves multiple timelines, I do and I don't. This is its own conversation. And we can go down the rabbit hole on that. Yeah. But that's the hang up. Yes. The hang up is free will. That's why people don't want to think about this stuff.
Yeah.
But I think we need to be brave and confront this idea. And that means temporarily taking your belief in free will, setting aside, and just see what the data shows us. And I think that it's kind of a cop-out to resort to sort of the many worlds and the multiple timelines and all that. Because in actual reality, if the Everettian many worlds interpretation were correct, it means that there's practically infinite parallel universes. There's not just one where, I got in the car accident and one where I didn't. Yeah. I mean, there's a million, not million, there's infinite variations there. So it immediately makes kind of absurd this idea that, I'm seeing an alternative timeline. I mean, how do you even constrain that? How do you make that into any kind of scientifically testable idea? And I find it implausible and not very interesting, honestly. I think it's much more interesting to think about how an actual future is inflecting or influencing us and sending us messages, but in a way that we inevitably misinterpret, so that those time loops happen. And this gets back to the Freud stuff, because Freud was a theorist of symbolic transformation, how events in our lives, and he thought that they were events in our past lives, not past lives, but I mean our prior history, get transformed symbolically, and our thoughts get transformed symbolically into dreams. Well, what I argue in Time Loops and my second book, Precognitive Dream Work and the Long Self, that it's actually precisely because of those time loops that have to be fulfilled that we as freely willed beings only get information from the future indirectly, obliquely, symbolically. And that's why there's this kind of ironic logic to fate. That's why fate has this kind of Oedipal logic where we fulfill prophecies precisely by trying to evade them, where, outcomes in our future, we don't see clearly. We see them symbolically transformed. We misunderstand them. And those misunderstandings get us to take the actions that lead to them. But that doesn't mean that we're fated to, if we have a dream about a car accident, we're going to have that car accident. Very often, a dream about a car accident, and there are tons of examples of this that I've collected from readers in my books, but also in the literature. People will have a dream about a car accident, and they'll come to the intersection where they're like, "Oh my God, I dreamed about a car accident here," and they'll suddenly be put on alert, and they'll just narrowly avoid a car accident. So yes, the obvious interpretation is that I took a different timeline. The dream was showing me one timeline, I took a different one. The simpler explanation is that collision in your dream was kind of a what if. It was kind of like a close call, and when we have a close call, we always imagine in our heads what would have happened. That catastrophizing thinking, and especially after we have a close call, we're like, oh my God, that could have, we could have collided. I think it's those thoughts about near misses, any thought that reminds you of your survival. That's the kind of stuff that refluxes back in time in your tesseract brain. And so, we have dreams about catastrophes that we in reality nearly miss or avoid. But there's a way in which our brain focuses on those kinds of near misses and situations that in one way or another remind us of our survival. Because it makes perfect sense, right? That precognition presentiment would arise as part of our sort of Darwinian reality of survival and our persistence in the block universe. That I think is the messages we're getting in precognition. So on the one hand, it's not an alternative timeline you're seeing. It's a what if. It's a thought about a near miss or a thought about a worst case that fortunately you avoided. So that's how I interpret those kinds of examples.
Are you familiar with Donald Hoffman by any chance? So he believes that, your perception itself has to be fitness selected. It has to actually be kind of perceptually adaptive in a way that it's not adaptive for you to actually see the substrate of underlying reality. And then you have this other guy, I believe his name is Dean Buonomo. Your brain is a time machine. And he talks about how our brains have to sort of work on lifetime scale. We can't work on these sort of cosmic time scales. And you touch on this with this concept of sort of the long body or the tesseract mind. So what does this mean? Is there's sort of this more primordial version of us that we're interacting with, and we interact with it when it's sort of these life and death, that of course it makes sense that you would get the prophecy about the car crash or whatever, because that part of you doesn't want to get in the car crash or something. That's like the most adaptive, naturally selected for thing for you to know. How does this work?
Well, that's a great question. And I think there it gets to this kind of dichotomy we talked about between the classical computer of the brain that's the classical computer of the brain has to be controlling our actions right in this moment and no other moment. Like, you don't want to be pre-spawning to something 10 seconds from now. You're going to be, completely dysfunctional. You have to, your body, your senses and actions and everything happening in your body has to be coordinated to be most effective at this instant in time. So that classical computer system of the brain, is really, it's doing that. But there's these probably quantum processes that are helping, for instance, syncing it up, like you have nerves that travel up the length of your body, like you step on a tack, that has to be synchronized with the immediate, the visual signal of the tack, which is immediate because your eye is right here. And so this is the Benjamin Libet's work back in the 70s and 80s, those landmark studies that he did showing that there's this neural syncing of all these different all this different sensory information that has different flight times, through the brain. So it all syncs up, but it puts us like a half second in our past, according to that prediction. But we're not half second in our past. So something quantum is probably going on there to readjust then these sensations and coordinate them. But then what you're asking about though is those longer time frame kind of precognitive or presentimental signals. Those have to sort of inflect us and orient us and maybe impact our decision making, for instance, or what we think of as our free will. So it's on that kind of level that precognition is operating. And there again, it's why it's always outside of conscious awareness, our consciousness. It's always it's not something we're aware of because it's not right now. It's not part of the now that the classical brain is constructing out of our experience. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's another reason why I'm impatient with people who keep throwing the word consciousness around in these contexts of psychic phenomena, and also, UFOs and stuff. Everyone wants to say consciousness. Consciousness is all about consciousness. I think that that's a distraction, and it doesn't help us see how these things actually work. But as you mentioned, Donald Hoffman, his work is really interesting. I don't know what to make of it. I feel like it's overstated a little bit. I feel like he's kind of overstated. I think a lot of scientists sort of do this when they want their ideas to have legs. I know I do it myself in my writing. I kind of overstate things a little bit because you want, have an interesting idea and you want to see if it sticks at the wall, like throwing spaghetti at the wall or whatever. I don't know if I would go as far as he does in saying that we don't perceive reality at all. He sort of likens our perception to icons on the computer screen, that what we're seeing is the fitness. I forget how he phrases it. We're seeing the fitness value of things. I don't know about that. I think he's partly right, certainly. But whether he's completely right, I don't know.
So do you believe we're in some sort of maybe Platonic cave and we're seeing something that is not at all like reality, and occasionally we sort of glimpse the light? Or do you think we're seeing something that's just perceptually adaptive, but
I don't know. I feel like it's somewhere in between. I think there's something slightly cave-like about our experience, but I wouldn't go so far as to kind of that sort of extreme kind of Gnostic view that we're in this, complete bubble, Truman Show kind of reality.
Well, where the Gnostics, are you familiar with Riz Verk? Do you know that?
Yeah.
So, he talks about kind of this simulation hypothesis, the multiverse simulation. And I'm sympathetic to this idea that maybe your consciousness is being ported into this sort of sensory reductive, 3D time-bound world, and that there is this more primordial self that the Greeks would, say you experience in forms of sort of noesis. You forget yourself when you're born, and this sort of anamnesis process.
Sure.
And then through these, mystery rituals that all these guys used to perform at like Eleusis, they experience their primordial selves. And so do you think that that's a possible model where you occasionally get these sort of downloads from on high, from your sort of higher self? But mostly you just have access to the kind of sensory stuff. But the senses are actually reductive on a default state of possibly greater omniscience. They're not sort of productive, which is, Aldous Huxley, William James, they would be sort of fans of this model as well.
Right. The reducing valve model. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What you're describing is, what mystics throughout time have said, that because they have these experiences of higher consciousness or whatever. And sort of there's this kind of implicit model that what we're living on a day-to-day basis is this kind of reduced, constricted, constrained thing. I mean, I think but again, we have, to just survive in the world, if we were going through life in this mystical state, we'd immediately get eaten by a predator. It's like you've got to deal with the real world and then sometimes, have these expanded experiences. Those are equally important, but I think it sells that pragmatic reality short to say, oh, it's like living in a cave. It's like, we need to have that reduced pragmatic focus a lot of the time, and yeah, we can't be living our higher self all the time. So this notion that we're evolving towards like always living a higher self kind of state, I don't quite buy that kind of evolutionary view in that sense.
How do UFOs play into all of this? I know UFO in some sense led you into this work yourself. Do you think UFOs have anything to do with the model overall of time that you have?
Yes and no. There's a common, oft heard claim nowadays in the UFO world and it goes along with this idea that, oh, it's really about consciousness and stuff. An oft heard idea that somehow our precognitive experiences and synchronicities and all those things are somehow part of the phenomenon or part of this UFO phenomenon, which I think is totally not true. I mean, precognition is intrinsic to who we are as creatures. And I think it's intrinsic to all life, probably. And people sort of think that they're all part of one thing, maybe because they get interested in them together, as I did. You have one remarkable experience, it's going to lead you to reading about other remarkable experiences and certainly openness to certain kinds of experiences. If you're open to seeing UFOs, you're probably open to your dreams and having precognitive dreams and so on. But I don't think there's any intrinsic connection there. But the UFO question is hugely interesting to me, and I think this time loops model is like really possibly very important. I'm totally in agreement with Mike Masters, who I know you've interviewed, that the strongest hypothesis, I think, about what is underlying the real core of the UFO phenomenon. I mean, I think there's a lot of deception and psyop stuff going on too, but at the real core there probably involves, very likely involves time traveling humans, or involves time traveling technology at the very least.
Yeah.
And if so, then all the things that we can start to understand about time travel just from our own experience and from that is to say our own precognitive experiences, and all these things that we were talking about, like time loops and the ways in which stuff from the future influences stuff in the past, and in a way that history is self-consistent. Those same factors are gonna be really important in time travel and in our development of time traveling technology. We already talked about the quantum computer sort of step towards that. I think that technology of communicating across time is going to kind of cause an acceleration, a technological acceleration towards more advanced technology and towards probably solving these problems of physical time travel. But yeah, I think time travel is hugely important. And so yeah, I mean, if there's a place to look for time travel besides quantum time traveling information, it's probably the UFO phenomenon.
Mm-mm. And maybe there's something about biology that is a porting of something that's a little more probabilistic or quantum, and maybe biology becomes vestigial in the future. And actually what we're interacting with is some sort of kind of quantum code or something that's unbound by biological constraints. Because I think about your model of time loops, and you're kind of glitching into some like information layer of the future or whatever. But the Mike Masters thing is like, you're literally seeing these like beings that are like from the future. And those are two very distinct things. And you could find some sort of like, biological matter transporter, but maybe more likely we just become these sort of quantum information systems or something that can, I don't know, time edit at will and, kind of show up at will and almost be more information theoretic, like in a John Wheeler model of the universe or something than, us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's all kinds of possibilities. I mean, I'm just, one of the, it's like one of the premises, like we talked about the peripheral, it's like at one point in the story, this, guy in the future, the user in the future, so it's the character in the 20th century. She happens to work at the local 3D print shop. Okay. And so he sends her instructions to 3D print this, future technology headset that enables her to like visit the future in an avatar and stuff like that. But that idea of 3D, printing out information in the present based on information from the future is going to be part of this, this halfway house basically to time travel, in the sense that, you could have, say, a drone operator in the future, control a drone in the past, and that's been built from future technology, but with present capabilities of a 3D printer, you could essentially have a future, time drone essentially flying around that's under the control of someone in the future, via an existing, 3D or the existing quantum server. So we're going to start seeing really interesting phenomena the moment the first quantum computers come online. And of course, the idea that maybe they're already online, in deep black programs somewhere, there's that, it's an interesting variant of the idea of a flying saucer coming through a wormhole, into the past. You could have a flying saucer that's been built in the present based on information from the future, and that's maybe even controlled by someone in the future via a quantum server. There's just all kinds of possibilities that I think we need to start thinking realistically, not just about, these high strangeness UFO encounters, but think about, well, what are the possibilities? What are the things that we're going to do when we have these technologies, maybe in a few years?
Yeah.
What are the effects that's going to have on society? What are the phenomena that we're going to start encountering in daily life because of this new relationship to our future when we have quantum computer servers that we leave plugged in, for years, decades, centuries? That's going to be transformative. If anything, that, I think of the idea of the singularity, the sort of brink after which human history becomes unpredictable. Well, I think that, it's not spiritual machines that are going to do it. It's this time traveling technology that comes from, or this informational time traveling technology that comes from quantum computer servers that are going to allow this new relationship to our future. And it could be incredibly destabilizing. It's like the first people to use these devices are going to get very rich by predicting stock fluctuations and all that. So I don't know. But
when we talked earlier about somebody having a premonition of a car crash and that being sort of adaptive because that's based on this like really important survival mode for them, that, they have to be cognizant of that when the event possibly is about to occur, so they swerve out or whatever. I had the thought that on a kind of a more macro scale, when it comes to humanity, these UFOs seem to show up consistently around nuclear sites.
Yeah.
And so if you were trying to find kind of the Archimedes lever, like the point of most leverage for affecting timelines. When it came to humanity, he would probably go straight to nuclear sites.
Yeah.
And so maybe that points to these things pushing us towards some teleology.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the point of time travel is, or one of the points of time travel is not going to be, people think of this in terms of, again, changing timelines and stuff. I think that's not the way to think about it. I think, you can go into the past and you can do stuff in the past and have effects, and you can plant the seeds for things that you will then harvest in the future. So, you can go into the past and affect things shape things in a way that will then pay off for you. You can plant, the way I put it in my second book is, you can plant seeds in the past for a better tomorrow. A simplistic example that I use, it's, there's all kinds of problems with this thought experiment, but just, go with me. So say you have a quantum computer server that's, that you leave plugged in from from now until, for centuries. And it's connected to, 3D printers, big 3D printers, industrial 3D printers. And say you're working for, you're an astronomer in the 22nd century, and you discover, an asteroid that's on collision course for Earth. And it's, you've detected it too late to intervene, to send a rocket to deflect the asteroid. But you have a quantum computer that's connected to 3D printers on the moon's far side, say, and you send an instruction to print out a rocket, 30 years in your past, and launch the rocket. And so it, when you detect the asteroid, but there's a rocket right there that destroys it because you launched it in the past. That kind of scenario, there's all kinds of ways in which that kind of logic can be incredibly useful for obvious reasons, not just in amassing huge wealth, but in, solving problems that ordinarily take too long to solve. If you can recruit the past to help you solve that problem. Or say, pandemics, say, there's this, a new, virus is discovered that's, super deadly, but you can, and it's going to be a huge pandemic unless you do something quickly. Well, you can, use the same setup to do kinds of all the needed trials and drug development, 10 years in the past, so that the vaccine is ready by the time the virus, presents itself. That kind of, using the past to solve problems in the present that wouldn't be soluble otherwise, because they just take too long. Not just because it's a computer, not just because it's a mathematical problem that requires too many years of number crunching, but because you actually need people and machines and infrastructure to deal with the problem, that takes time. So that kind of thing, again, this is why I see this kind of intermediate technology towards physical time travel being like super important in coming years, with quantum computation.
There are other models of physical time travel that involve possibly manipulation of gravity, which is very related to time in the general relativity.
Well, that's
context.
The next thing. That's what will come next. You know? And there you're not limited to going, sending information back in time just to when you turned on your quantum computer. And there you're free to travel as far back as you want in time, potentially, whether you're using a wormhole or what I call a time ship, which would be, some kind of.
Are you familiar with Die Glocke? Do you know what that is?
No.
This the Nazi bell, where you create a super high voltage over a short distance, and it's this bell with a ceramic internal chamber where there are two ways to change gravity, to affect gravity, enough mass and enough energy. We think of not being able to have the capacity to have enough energy to actually affect gravity in a real way, but if you have enough mass, you can obviously do it. if you have tons and tons of energy, you might be able to do it with really high voltages, electric plasma thrusters. So there's this rumor of this like Nazi Wunderwaffe program under SS officer Hans Kammler. And he had this sort of bell-shaped object. And the guys that were working on this reportedly were Ernest Grawitz, who was head of the SS medical division. So that probably means, would imply that there are people involved.
Right.
And Walter Gerlach, who was a gravity physicist. He was a physicist very focused on gravity. And you would put somebody inside the chamber and you would pour the whole thing with so much voltage that you'd create kind of a different inertial reference frame inside the chamber. So like every second on the outside would be 1,000th of a second on the inside. You'd slow time down, just like in a black hole in general relativity. The closer you get to a black hole, the more time slows at, gravitational source. And you walk out, and all of a sudden you're 1,000 years in the future. So it's a sort of wacky model, but I got really interested in this, mid-century inventor, this kind of gravity inventor named Thomas Townsend Brown.
Right.
And kind of the subtext of his whole story is actually that he's extremely interested in time travel, and that he thinks that gravity manipulation leads to time travel.
Sure.
And so I find that kind of a very fascinating little, maybe part of maybe it's the intermediate step before, pure information transfer, a la the movie The Fly or something.
Right. That's cool.
Yeah. Do you think, I think about, have you read the lectures by Schrodinger, like What is Life?
No, I have not. I have not read it. Yes.
Cause he talks about these aperiodic crystals in the DNA that are somehow really important information receptacles for, and it's sort of speculative, and I think he doesn't really have like a really good model for this at the time. I don't even think we had the double helical structure of DNA at the time. It was in 1944, right?
It was discovered, yeah.
So he's talking about this, and I think what he's sort of implying is that like that's the port between the sort of quantum world and the more biological world or something.
Well, that's really interesting you say that, because I've thinking back to this idea of like 3D printing something based on information from the future. This is totally speculative, but what if DNA is like a quantum server, and that that's DNA controls the protein the proteins and all that. So what if that is essentially what we are, is 3D printed drones essentially based on information from our evolutionary future. It just sort of opens up
that's fascinating.
Really interesting.
Well, Maxwell's equations work forwards just as they work backwards. Right. And the more I get deep into the UFO thing, the only time the door shuts on me is around this model of what's called extended electrodynamics. It's not around like UFOs are real, like that's being pushed clearly. But there's this like secret science component of all of this. And I think it's like this extended electrodynamics, this idea that actually a more faithful adherence to the original 21 Maxwell's equations and not the kind of compression of Oliver Heaviside into these 4 vector calculus equations might actually represent, true reality more, and actually allow for all these exotic wave types outside of the transverse Hertzian wave. And so it might explain some of this sort of, this eye stuff that's like spooky action at a distance. It's kind of weird because you don't get the typical, electrons pairing off sort of thing, or attenuation over space-time or through material or whatever. But there's one of these wave types, I realize this is a crazy rabbit hole, but one of these wave types is called heliocoidal, and it's shaped like DNA. Yeah. And so there's this guy named Konstantin Meil, and he's in the Black Forest of Germany, and he's studying, this extended version of electrodynamics on plants. And he thinks that, it can affect DNA and these sort of super. And you had this guy, Luc Montagnier, who's this French Nobel Prize winner. At the end of his life, he was saying, electromagnetism is really important for communication, information transfer within DNA, within these aqueous nanostructures in DNA. I have no idea whether any of this is true, but DNA it's so clearly this information receptacle. Right. Like, and that's clearly what it's there for. I mean, you can cold store semantic information on it, like from use it like a computer server. Yeah. It just takes a while to retrieve. So it's just fascinating.
Yeah, I want to know. I'm not I'm not a physicist, and I'm certainly not a quantum physicist, and I'm not a quantum biologist. So I'm at a certain limit with my understanding. But it's speculatively, it's fascinating, and I would love to know more about the quantum computing processes or aspects or capabilities of DNA. Yeah, because it seems like that could be key.
Totally. What do you think of John Wheeler? Because I'm a big fan of his, and I've heard you talk about him in other interviews. And to me, he comes closest to my model of the world with the sort of information theoretic approach. Yeah,
totally. I love Wheeler, and I'm particularly fond of his U diagram. Are you familiar with his that diagram he wrote? With the U, it's kind of more of a glyph, of the U with where one tip of the U is the Big Bang and the other tip is an eyeball staring back at the Big Bang.
Yeah.
And that I think is right. I mean, I think he was working with not quite retrocausation. He was working with that kind of model that, well, you can affect a system by deciding whether to measure it as a particle or wave. That kind of
delayed choice.
That delayed choice is sort of that again is kind of I think a conceptual halfway house to true retrocausation.
Yep.
But if you add real retrocausation in there, which I think there are some very compelling models of real retrocausation. I mean, Yakir Aharonov, his two-state vector formalism, and
Kramer.
The ideas. Kramer, yeah. I mean, Kramer's a bit different.
It's a handshake.
It's a handshake agreement, but it doesn't. I don't think Kramer's model really allows like affecting the past in the way that I think Aharonov's model might. Anyway, if you add to Wheeler's U a real retrocausal interpretation of quantum mechanics, plus all the time traveling technology and all those possibilities that become more and more potentially prevalent in the universe as the universe ages, like you have the potential of truly retrocausing, retrocausing the Big Bang, in a big loop. And I love that model.
And if time travel becomes possible at any point in the future, it's inherently always been possible.
Right.
Which is fast.
Right. Well, if it becomes possible at any point in the future, then time travelers have always been here.
Exactly.
And could be present at the beginning of the universe.
And it would explain the alien thing. And it would explain all this sort of like forbidden archaeology stuff. You have like the Antikythera mechanism and all sorts of like precociously advanced architecture from the past. And, all the alien mythology and lore, it would just be these sort of time editing, future versions of ourselves that have figured out time travel and are maybe trying to sway things towards a specific teleology.
What, also interests me is the possibility that the search for dark matter and dark energy could be, that this may have something to do with that what if these trans-temporal effects, what if the effects of massive time traveling technology or wormholes or something are affecting the mass of galaxies in their future, and that somehow affects things in the present that we can't detect.
Oh, that's fascinating.
I just, again, I'm beyond my level of cosmological understanding, but it just seems like, there's retrocausation and time travel are the things missing from our understanding of so many phenomena right now. I feel like there's going to be a paradigm shift. There's got to be a paradigm shift. That where people wake up and go, oh.
Well, I think, Steven Spielberg, who I think is very clued into all the UFO stuff, has, since he was, I think, a kid, he was super into UFO. Obviously, he made E.T., he made, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He's told this guy, Robert Liefeld, who I think created Deadpool, that, the UFOs are like, what do you think is more likely? That these are like, from Zeta Reticuli or Proxima Centauri, or that there are future selves sort of guarding our present and making sure that certain timelines get sustained. And I just think that is the clearest, kind of Occam's razor explanation. And it is paradigm shifting, and it's bizarre to kind of conceive of. And yet it's very interesting, and it would also involve factions. It would involve maybe different versions,
Right.
depending on which type of universe you believe in.
Yeah.
It might involve different versions of the future trying to sustain themselves or something.
Well, or just different, different future faction. There doesn't need to be a unified,
Sure.
civilization in our future. I mean, we're very divided now, and we fight amongst ourselves, and countries are at war with each other. That could happen across time too. You could have, I don't know, just to take some example, Russian time travelers in 50 years going back in time to the United States and meddling in ways that will benefit them in the future. And just as you might have American time travelers in 50 years, we could have like multiple factions, intervening in each other's histories.
And what do you think of Philip K. Dick? You write about him from nowhere, and you kind of talk about him, and you talk about Jacques Vallée, who's a massive fan of his.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of both, but I also think their worldview is just so fascinating. And specifically Philip K. Dick, I think people don't fully realize how real he thought a lot of this stuff was, and how autobiographical a lot of his stories are. You bring up Vallis. But I think he even gave a speech in Metz in France in like 1976 or 7, where he goes, no, like the Man in the High Castle was actually a real timeline where, there are these simulators, and they simulated this version of World War II where the Japanese and the Germans won, and they, cut America in half. And then they decided to rewind the clock because that, didn't quite work out. And the simulators were rewinding the JFK assassination multiple times, trying to make it work out. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, no, he was a fascinating character, and definitely troubled. I mean, he had a million different versions of reality going on, and was pretty fucked up guy in a lot of ways, but brilliant, and probably he was the only artist that I've studied in my work on artists and writers who really understood and basically accepted what I'm arguing, which is that artists are influenced by their future. I mean, that he knew he was a precog. He knew he was precognitive, and it wasn't just, these weren't just empty claims. I mean, it's very clear in his writing. He was sometimes writing about his own future experiences. And you can see, actually, you can go back to his letters. I mean, he was very open at writing about his dreams and stuff in letters. And you can see even examples of precognition that he didn't detect.
That's wild. What's an example of that? So that shows it's not all this crazy signaling where he's just trying to act like.
There's an example that I write about in my new book, that my argument in one of the chapters of my new book is that, he and Jacques Vallée were kind of precognizing each other's work. And that, in fact, Vallis is Vallée. Because they both read each other's work. They were both writing in 1974, 1975. That's when Vallée was writing The Invisible College, and that's when Dick was writing the first draft of what became Vallis. It was at that point, they published that first draft posthumously. It's Radio Free Albemuth. But he already had this word had come to him, Vallis, and this story that he wrote around this idea is all to be found in Jacques Vallée's book. The idea of a teaching satellite, and the idea of people receiving, awakened people receiving signals from some distant star that are designed to save us from some peril or whatever. There's so many parallels between these two books, but neither of them could have read each other at that point. So the argument is a little complex, but yeah, there's a convergence there, a precognitive convergence, I think. But one of the examples of Phil Dick's many precognitive dreams was that around, I think this was in 1974, he had a dream where there are a lot of details of this dream, but it was like there was these diminutive, these small alien creatures, I think came out of a spaceship, gave him some piece of technology, but there was another part of the dream where he was shown a brownie, I think, that had been scored by a fork around its edges, and it was somehow a relief map. Okay. But it was to do with this. Oh, and someone told him, "Oh, don't take that. It belongs to Betty Fields." He misremembered the name Betty Hill as Betty Fields. And he thought, "Oh, this is a reference to the UFO abductee." So 3 years later, he's like super excited when he sees Close Encounters. And he doesn't make a connection to that dream, but a dream of like diminutive childlike creatures coming out of a spaceship, a piece of food that's scored by a fork around the edges. I mean, that's the scene in Close Encounters where he scores, mashed potatoes around the edge, and it's a relief map. Turns out to be a relief map essentially of Devil's Tower. And the idea, and that all being linked to a UFO, someone who's had a UFO encounter. I think it work. That's the way precognitive dreams work. They work on associations, they don't present something literally, but they present, a set of associations around this core thing. I think he was precognizing Spielberg's movie.
That's fascinating.
But people precognize movies that way all the time. So he was, but there's so many examples like that. And a lot of them he was aware of, he'd have this dream and then, oh my God, the next day, this thing happens, and it was just like in his dream. And, he's not making this stuff up.
I have a really weird, actually personal example that just came out. I'll figure out whether I'm going to cut this or not, but I was hanging out with a friend and he was like, "Man, like you should go to France." He just said it out of nowhere. And I was like, why should I go to France, man? And he was like, "I don't know. I kind of see you dating a French girl or something." And I was like, "Interesting. Okay." And he was like, my last girlfriend, he knew her. And he was like, "Yeah, she was, British, but she kind of had like this American mentality. Like, I think you need like a true European mentality, whatever." And he's like, I'm convinced of this because I just saw this movie, Before Sunset, made by Richard Linklater, and the main character's name is Jesse. And I'm like, "Man, I love that movie. I love Richard Linklater. He's amazing." I'm like, "That movie's incredible." And he's like, "Yeah, I kind of see you with this, like, the character, like Julie Delpy or whatever."
Yeah.
I'm like, "She's awesome. She's beautiful. I would be down for that." And so the next day, on a whim, I book a trip to France, and I end up being there for the whole summer. And in Paris, I end up dating a girl, and then I come back, and her name is Celine. I come back and I watched the movie Before Sunset, and her name was Julie Delpy's character's name. Isn't that weird?
That's incredible. Yeah.
It's nuts.
Well, there's a time loop there.
That's a time
because
loop.
he told you this, and then
literally
it affected your actions.
And I was thinking about it in the back of my head, where I'm like, that's kind of why I made the decision, which is crazy to make a decision based on that. But it felt like, the right synchronicity or something to act on. But
synchronicity is sort of the go-to term that people use when this kind of stuff happens.
Yeah.
Because they don't have a concept of precognition for the most part.
Yeah.
So, synchronicity will work,
Maybe precognition. Yeah.
That's great.
But and then Jacques Vallée is how I learned of Valis, because I was at his apartment and he was like, "This is my favorite book." So maybe you're onto something. But Eric, I appreciate your time, man. This was awesome. We could probably go much longer, but this was fantastic. And everybody go out and buy From Nowhere. It's a really fantastic book, and time loops.
Thank you very much. It's been fun finally getting to sit down and talk.
We made it happen.